Galatians 4, 1 through 7. I'm going to begin reading in verse 1. Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he's owner of everything. But he's under guardians and managers until the date set by the father. So also we, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. I think a great title for this is No Longer a Slave, but a Son. As you know, the focus and emphasis on Christmas gets earlier and earlier and earlier every year. And that's why it's important for us at a time like this to focus before the season begins. There are those who say, let's get rid of the celebration. It doesn't accomplish a lot. We're not going to get rid of it. It's really refocusing ourselves on what the purpose of it is. We are right in between two special days. One is 12 days from now. December the 7th, there will be a gathering at Pearl Harbor. It will be a Pearl Harbor Commemoration Day. At the Naval Station, Pier Harbor at Kilo Pier, they will celebrate the 71st anniversary commemoration of that occasion. And of what took place at 7:40 a.m. December 7, 1941. I was just a little over a year old. By the way, it's interesting, just as a matter of reference. I went to Africa the first time as a little child. And we went by ship in those days. It was the only way to go. Couldn't afford planes. Now it's the other way around. But on the ship in front of us had been sunk in the war. Therefore, because of that, we went out in a convoy just to protect ourselves and be able to get there safely. So the setting is somewhat significant in that set. But the trouble is we tend to forget. We forget what happened that December 7th, 1941. And people will gather to commemorate it just again to remind themselves of what took place, and USS Arizona and all of that, the commemoration of that. Again, there will be a ship goes by, such as here as the USS Russell in a few years back. And they will pass by and do honor to the USS Arizona and all those who died that day. Again, there will be a rifle salute, echo taps and so forth, and many people who themselves have some connection with that day will be there. All kinds of people of different ages. But the reason for all of this is, again, the danger that we might forget. So we will again remember 8 American battleships, 10 other vessels damaged, almost 200 American aircraft destroyed, approximately 3,000 military personnel wounded or killed on that single day. The outcome again, December 8th, war was declared against the Japanese, and December 11th, war was declared against Germany and Italy. There's another commemoration, though, that is interesting. We've just passed it just 14 days ago. Better known as Armistice Day. But we've called it Veterans Day, and that's okay. But the difficulty of that, by the way, it's interesting because in Canada, I was born in British Columbia, just north of here. And during that time of the year, which is again 2 weeks ago, you will see poppies in every store and bank there. They've got them there for you to take, and people will be walking down the street with this because in remembrance of in Flanders Field the poppies grow. A commemoration of the fields where so many of our loved ones were buried in defense of our nation. First Battle of Flanders began in October 1914. Dates are not important necessarily, but just the perspective is. Tactical stalemate in trench warfare. It terminated for 4 years, and many were there at that time. My grandfather for one of them. The Second Battle of Flanders took place in September-November 1918. Decisive victory, armistice, was signed November 11, 1918. In Flanders, the second phase of the battle took place. May 10, 1940, German forces, Belgium and Holland. May 28th, Belgian army surrenders. French and British armies surrounded and doomed. The outcome again, Dunkirk. 335,000 were evacuated by small boats and all kinds of things to get the people off. Great victory, but great Allied disaster. 1,151,588 casualties for the U.S. Massive. 294,578 killed, 707,325 wounded, 28,002 reported missing, 116,000 prisoners of war. Soviet Union, 12 to 15 million lives. 1/2 of them were civilians. Ukraine, 2,500,000 dead, 1,500,000 missing. Germans, 7,400,000 died, aimed, or permanently injured. See, it's so easy to forget. It just is. And yet so much of what we have rests upon what took place on those dates. The conclusion is this. What we should be remembering, Pearl Harbor, Armistice Day, Memorial Day, has not become a day of remembrance of those things. I remember when we were in school so many years ago in college, we said, how come we don't get a vacation on these days? And they said, because you wouldn't go out to remember the dead, you'd go out to celebrate. Why in the world take a vacation from school? They were right. What we so often do instead, and it is not a time of reflection as it should be, it becomes a time of self-gratification. Now you say, why that? Because as you and I come to this Christmas season, a matter worth noting, what we should be remembering is the birth of Messiah Jesus, the fact that God became man, the fulfillment of messianic prophecy. And yet what we so often do is the same thing. It's not a time of reflection as it should be. It becomes a time of self-gratification. I mean, just back away for a bit, because come December 25, and the date isn't the right date, and you know that. That's not even the point of it. It becomes a time when so many of us feel bad because we didn't get, or because it didn't work out just the way we wanted to. And the issue becomes about ourselves, not about what it should be. You know, let me just... It's interesting because there's the Lord's table and there's the Lord's Supper. The Lord's table is the commemoration of just his death and resurrection, the cup and the bread. The Lord's Supper was different. You know, the night before he was killed, he had a final supper. So the early Christians decided, let's have a supper, just like they had a supper. Paul writes and says, listen, nobody commands you to have a supper. They did tell you to remember the Lord's table, but not to have the Lord's Supper. Now, you can have the Lord's Supper if you want to. The trouble is, you've made it not the Lord's Supper, you've made it your supper. You come there and you fight to get the meal. Some of you are eating a lot, others aren't getting stuff to eat, and it's become a selfish thing. And don't call it the Lord's Supper if it's your supper. If you want to make it the Lord's Supper, then remember the Lord. If you want to make it your supper, then have your supper and do whatever you want. But don't call it his supper and do it your way. Same reason. God didn't command us to celebrate Christmas. He didn't. And if you have a tree or don't have a tree, that's your business. That's not the issue. But if you're going to call it a celebration of the birth of Christ, then make it a celebration of the birth of Christ. If not, just call it a big happy party. And just make it that. But don't call it one thing and make it something else. So I bring you back to this. Is it a time of self-gratification or is it a time of reflection? By the way, I have more fun just before Christmas. I don't like the pressure, and I love going to a mall and watching people, you know, rush into parking places and just, you know, you've got the right to place, but you back up and let them in there. Or you go into a store and you let people in front of you in line. I have more fun doing that because it shocks people, because everybody's pushing and shoving and trying to grab the next parking place, even if they know somebody else should have it. Let's stop. Let's just stop and back up a little bit. Now, in light of this, I want to come to Galatians 4:1-7 because we've been looking at Galatians here, but I want to deal with this passage. It's an incredible passage. I want to look at these things that we should be remembering. Not all these other things, the fact of Christ's birth, the time of his coming, the manner of his coming, the purpose and the result. Look at this with me, if you will. First of all, notice something as you start in this passage. It's interesting, the setting is here. Paul has given the personal part of this epistle in chapters 1 and 2, which you've already seen. He then gives a doctrinal purpose. He defends his own ministry, first chapter 1, 2. He defends the gospel. And then he applies all of this, the practical part, in chapter 5, 2 and following. In the doctrinal part, it is the letter proper. It is what this letter is all about. Faith and law, freedom and bondage. He bases his argument on the believer's experience, 3:1-5. You've been over this, so let me just back it up. He bases his argument on Scripture, looking at Abraham. Then he bases on the purpose of the Mosaic Law, 3:19-25. He then presents the new relationship through Christ, and then comes this passage. He presents Christ's provision through Jesus Christ. The whole, by the way, the whole thing that gives any kind of excitement and hope to all of this is the fact that Jesus Christ came. He is the fulfillment of the law. He is the one who provides hope for us. Now, walk with me. The fact of his coming, notice, in the fullness of time, it says in verse 4, God sent forth his Son. That's interesting. The word is used here is apostello, and is to send with a mission. It's not just to send. He sent him with a purpose. He sent him with a mission. He didn't just send him. It's interesting, the word he sent out from himself, ex apostello, out from himself. In other words, he and the Father and the Son were side by side in glory, and God the Father sent out from himself his Son. You know, isn't it fascinating just you think about it this way? So much of what Christmas has become is a time for the family to get together. And we make such a focus on that. And yet is it not significant that you see, it was not the Son and the Father coming together, it was the Son and the Father being separated that is the whole foundation for all that Christmas is. Interesting here as you look at this whole God sent forth, there's a clear progression in this passage. First of all, there's a focus on Christology, a picture of who Christ is. Then there's a focus on soteriology, which is what Christ did. He came to save us. Then there's a focus on pneumatology, which is the Holy Spirit, and that you have been looking at in the last few weeks together. You know, here you start. We must first see Christology. In other words, who was Christ? If you don't understand who Christ was, then his coming to earth doesn't do it, you see. Who being in the form of God, I'm Philippians 2, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God. I'm quoting the Authorized Version. If you want the NSB, he didn't feel that the equality was something to hold on to. Who being in the form of God. What he did, he came down to this earth and was made in the likeness of man. He took upon the form of a servant first, and then was made in the likeness of man. The whole point of this, if you don't understand how great he was, you won't understand how great his coming to earth is. You see, this is what we have to understand before we can understand this. Jesus Christ was fully God. In every way, he was God. By the way, you understand when he came to earth, he did not stop being God. He couldn't stop being God. Jesus Christ could not be God. It's impossible. It says he emptied himself, and we've tried to understand that because the songwriter says he emptied himself of all but love. That's not true. Although it sings nice and it sounds nice. You know what he did? He totally gave up the independent use of his attributes. Was he all-powerful? Yes, but he gave that up. Not the all-powerfulness, but the independent use of that. For example, when you have someone talk about, Christ knew it was the heart of all men, you say, well, because he was God. No. Let me stop, time out, okay? It's not like he as man decided to go into his phone booth and put on his God suit and decide for a while to see as God did. No, everything Jesus did, he did because God the Father made it clear to him through the Spirit. That's what he did. Understand that. He was fully man. Fully man. He set aside the independent use of his attributes. Now you say, oh, come on now. You remember the prophet and his servant who... You remember when the Syrian officer came and had leprosy and he was healed and wanted to give all these presents to the prophet, and the prophet said, I don't want your presents. As he drove away, the servant went after him, not telling the prophet he did, and he says, my boss, he wants some of these things. And he took this stuff and came back and he did it. And as he came back, the prophet said, was I not going with you all the way? How in the world did he see what his servant was doing except that God revealed it to him? Same thing when Christ was on earth. Understand the fullness of his deity and the fullness of his humanity. I will go one step further while we're here. I've often made the comment, when we look at Christ, see, our problem is when we look at his humanity on earth, we so deify his humanity we don't comprehend it. See, we look at him as God. He was God, but he was God setting aside his attributes and coming fully as man. Okay, but now look at him. He's gone to heaven now. Just think about this. John the Beloved laid on Jesus' breast at the final supper, but when he saw him 60 plus years later on the Isle of Patmos, he didn't run up and hug him. What did he do? He fell at his feet as a dead man. Why we like singing songs in praise of him as Jesus is because we like to focus on his humanity and the closeness we feel to him. But understand, if you saw Jesus today, you wouldn't touch him and you wouldn't hug him. You'd fall at his feet as a dead man because you'd realize how incredibly separated from us he is. And yet he sees fit to reach down and touch us in the hour of our need and be with us. Just to remember that. We have so deified his humanity, we don't comprehend his humanity. We've so humanized his deity, we don't comprehend his deity. Jesus Christ, fully God, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. Now, as you come to this, God sent him out intentionally and from eternality. Now, just some things here. His son. We don't have time to look at all these, and we're not going to, but Hebrews 1, he's his unique son. God spoke to us without an article in Greek, which he spoke to us in the one who is by quality Son of God. We are as sons of God. But listen, God has only one son, and all other sons are sons through him. Christ is uniquely the Son of God as none of us can ever be. He was his eternal son. The Word was God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. This is eternal Son. God sent forth his all-powerful Son. It's in him everything was created. He uses three prepositions: in him, through him, for him, all creation took place. His all-powerful Son. His incarnate Son. Romans 1, he was the one who was declared to be the Son of God. He was made the incarnate Son, but declared to be the Son of God. His promised Son, he shall be great, Luke 1 and 2. His royal Son, he's the seed of David. His coming Son, he's coming again in like manner as you've seen him go. This is the Son of God. He came to this earth for you and me. Though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, that you through his poverty might be enriched. You know, I read that verse because of my human way of looking at things. I thought, though he was rich in heaven, he became poor. I thought his poverty was in a manger and all of this. No. His impoverishment was becoming a man. That was his impoverishment. He was rich, and yet he became poor. He became like us, that we through his poverty might be enriched, become like him. Fact of his coming. The other thing that stands out in this passage, not only the fact of his coming, but the time of his coming. Look at this statement. In the fullness of time, God sent out from himself his only Son. Now, I want to talk about this because this is incredible. In the fullness of time, prophetically. Look at this. There are two genealogies. Now, you may see it differently. That's fine. It is all right with me because it isn't the beginning and end of all things. I think there are two genealogies. One's in Matthew 1 and the other's in Luke 3. The one focuses, if you will, on the line of David. Both of them, the line of David, 2 Samuel 7, there's going to be a son born to him. Joseph, you see, as I see it, Joseph is the one through whom the legal right to the throne comes. Mary is the one through whom the blood right to the throne comes. I think they're two distinct genealogies with some of the same names, but it's immaterial. The reason, by the way, you see, there was a statement by God that part of Solomon's line should not have a seat on the throne. And yet it was through the other part that Mary came, and so therefore you have the blood right through Mary and the legal right through Joseph. It was the line of David. 2 Samuel 7 runs through both of them. Joseph and Mary, Zacharias and Elizabeth, God's guidance that way. Bethlehem, it's an amazing statement. God says the child's going to be born in Bethlehem. And you know what? Augustus Caesar comes to the throne, and now he's on the throne, and he needs to expand the empire. We're going to talk about that in a while. He needs to expand the empire, and he expanded further than anybody before him had done. But in expanding the empire, he needs money. To get money, he must tax. To tax, he must find who can pay the tax. Therefore, all over the world, he did this thing. Everybody should go and be registered so he'd know who the taxable people were. Now, you understand something. This isn't like today. So every part of the world didn't do it on the same day. Is it not significant that what they decided to do in the area of Palestine is to do it on that specific time? There would be time specifically the time that Mary would be ready to conceive a child, and they would come to Bethlehem because Joseph was the line and lineage of David. They would come to Bethlehem to be registered, and they would just happen. I love the term in Ruth. It says she happened to happen by the field of Boaz. Isn't it something? Joseph and Mary happened to be in Bethlehem just at the time the baby was to be born in fulfillment of God's divine stated prophecy. Amazing. It all ties in together. Zacharias and Elizabeth, their story, and how Zacharias chosen to go in as the priest, to present himself in the holy place. And as he comes in there on that day, and it was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, how it should happen just 9 months before his son John should be born, and God could declare to him the fact that he would be the one who was the father of a child who would come to prepare the way for the Messiah. Everything prophetically was the fullness of time. Try this linguistically. There are three people, Xerxes, Alexander the Great, and Augustus Caesar. Well, let me just talk to you about them for a while. Don't do these. Watch these dates because of what they say. Don't be worried about the dates themselves. 600, 606, 605. Captivity began, and Daniel's taken into captivity. Daniel in 530 gives the account that we have in the book of Daniel. Okay, just keep this in mind. Darius begins reigning in 522. Xerxes reigns for 50 years. He begins in 486. There are three kings between Cyrus and Xerxes. We'll just come down to there, and these are the three. Xerxes then comes to the throne 486. Now here comes this. Alexander the Great comes to the throne 334 to 330. He reigns, okay? Just with me. Now watch this. Between the time of Daniel's prophecy and this, 200 years happen. God could tell you exactly, and if I could go through that, I would do it with you. He gave exact details of what's going to happen when Alexander moves south from Syria, the northern part, right down through the land of Palestine. He told exactly what happened in Zechariah chapter 9, 200 years before it ever happened. Actually, 150 for Zechariah's count. Here's what he told us. Darius Astasius, just watch this, okay? Don't worry, but just watch the fact, because it's a beautiful picture. Darius Astasius was Darius the Great. He comes to battle against the Greeks, and he's got this big army that comes, and he gets beat big time by the Greeks. Shouldn't have happened, but it happened. It's the Battle of Marathon. It's where we get into marathon races and so forth. This is the monument, Marathon Monument. You know what happened? When the victory was happened, one of the Greek fellows ran back some 26 miles or so back to report it, and as soon as he reported, he fell over dead. And that's where the whole idea began. But here's the statement. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and protection for him. And now I'll tell you the truth. Behold, this is a few next later. 3 more kings are going to rise in Persia, Cambyses, Smerdis, and Darius. Then a fourth, Xerxes, not named. Fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will rouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. God prophesied this way before it happened and said exactly who would do it. By the way, it's interesting, even this detail. When Xerxes came to power, the empire was falling apart, and they didn't have the manpower, so through his great riches, he amassed the money, and he hired an army to go against the Greeks. That's the whole point of this, exactly what happened. Now watch this, just with me. Here's what happens. Xerxes is going to pay back because his dad got beaten, so therefore he's going to come pay back, okay? So he comes like this and marches across there, crosses the Hellespont, which is a narrow body of water there. And actually what's funny, he got there in this very narrow place, so he put his ships across, and having his men march across these ships to get the other side, and God sent a massive storm. He gets out there with a cloak and starts beating the water as if it's supposed to obey him and submit to him. God was in control, but anyhow, he got across there. He came down to what you know as the Battle of Thermopylae, and where a Greek trader gave, them away around whatever, and anyhow, the Battle of Thermopylae. He then came down, he wins at Thermopylae, burns Athens, and then he is defeated at the Battle of Salamis and Plataea. And actually what happened, he had gone back by this time before Plataea. He left his army with one of his generals, and he got beat, and that was the end of it that way. But here's what happened. He instilled in the Greek a hatred for them and a desire to pay back. So now notice what happens. By the way, just show you some pictures here. This is Athens. This is Mars Hill, where Paul did his preaching. Marcus' place is right down below here. But the reason I show you this is because standing up there, you can see out here where, I love this because I love history, but you see the battle that was the great battle that was fought there on the waters where they didn't expect to be beat was right in this section right here. I made sure I drove down there to get the pictures, but anyhow, the point is, later it says, a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. Daniel 11:3. The ram which you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media Persia. I'm taking 2 different passages here. And the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king, Alexander the Great. And I saw him, the goat, come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, Media Persia, if you will. The ram had no strength to withstand him. That's Alexander the Great. Watch this. Alexander. 335, 150 years after the prophecy, okay? He's 21 years of age. By the way, he had done all his conquering by the time he was 26. In our country, he'd still be home being under his family's medical program. But anyhow, he was out there doing his thing, all right. 21 years of age. Just think about this. He gets his army together and he crosses the Hellespont the other way. He says, this is payback time. And so therefore, he's going to go back and do what Xerxes done. So the first battle is at the Granicus River because the king of the Persians then came up here to fight him. It was another Darius. He beats him there, which opens up all of this space to him. But just follow this with me. He comes across, and notice what he comes. This is Turkey. And I put these Lystra, Derbe, we know Tarsus, where Paul is from. He came across that region. And he comes down into here, and there's a battle of Issus right here where he conquers Darius the next time, which gives him access to come down into this section. He comes all the way down in here into Damascus and down to Tyre. You can read all of that in Zechariah chapter 9. And then he gets access all the way down here to where he has a town built after him in a library, Alexandria, of course, as you will know, in Egypt. And then he comes back up, and God, by the way, prophesied. He's going to bypass Jerusalem. He's not going to harm them on the way down and on the way back in. That's exactly what happened. Now, politically, not only, let me talk about, just let me go back to the linguistic thing for a bit. I'll do this. You know, it's interesting because when he came over there to that part of the world and defeated it, okay, Alexander, he brought the Greek language with him. For most of my 37 years as a seminary professor, I taught Greek, and this is the Greek Testament. The reason we have the New Testament in Greek is because Alexander the Great. He came over, he united the whole world under a single language. Now, the Latin language was certainly used, but the Greek language is the language of trade, and is the language in which the New Testament was written. And God planned all of that ahead of time, prepared it, so that whenever you went anywhere, you could use the same language to communicate, because this was the common trade language. Why? Because of a early 20-year-old man who came there and brought the Greek culture and Greek language and spread throughout the entire region. Then politically. It's interesting because you know the story of Julius and Augustus Caesar, sort of, to this part. Julius is betrayed by Brutus. Remember the statement, et tu, Brute. And you, Brutus, you are one of them, was going to kill me, so Brutus kills him. Brutus wants to rule, but it doesn't happen. Brutus is chased out of the city of Rome. So he comes to this beautiful area called Cavala, which, as we know in the New Testament, is Neapolis. He parks his fleet there, okay? But he comes over here to Philippi, which we know from a different thing because of the book of Philippians. This is where, when Augustus and so forth went after Brutus to get him because of what he did to Julius, he comes there, and this is where they fought, and this is where Brutus is killed, and again, this is what's left of it. Not my beautiful wife here in the foreground, but the family you see. So all of this is the ruins of the Forum of Philippi, which came around that time. We come back to Rome, and I'll show you why this is. We're here at the Colosseum, but I want to show you something on the wall of the Colosseum. And I do this, I'll come back to the Colosseum in a while. This is on the wall of the Colosseum. This shows the whole of the area that Augustus Caesar expanded the empire to. Well, watch this, because there are 4 pictures on the wall. The first picture is this. You realize it's not called the Italian Empire, it's called the Roman Empire. It's named after a city, not after a country. That's interesting. So the first picture you see on the wall is this picture of the city of Rome. That's where it all started. Julius then expands this thing further, and now it's going to go out further, and it's going to become this big. But now Augustus Caesar takes over, and look what he did. He expands this thing big time, starts to expand it further, and finally, this is the last picture you find. And why this is significant in this realm is it's just showing how the Roman Empire, starting under this city of Rome, expanded the whole world. Now, why is this important? In our day, if we want to travel somewhere, do you have a passport? Do you have a visa? Paul was a Roman citizen. He didn't have to get a passport to go anywhere. Look at where he could go. These are all the places he went. I just go put them there. They don't have to give them names. You just see where they're located. But watch this. Why could he go to all these places? Number one, he could go there and preach in Greek. And number two, he could go there because he was a Roman citizen. And this whole world God has established and prepared for the very purpose of this, just to prepare him for this evangelistic ministry. And notice this, I put Spain in there because I think he got there, although we don't have the recorded statement of Scripture that he did, only a statement that he wanted to go there. Why could he go to all these places? Because of the expansion of the Roman Empire. You listen to me. Christ came at a precise time in human history. He didn't just happen to show up and all this happened. God had this all prepared. Why do you think God cares about Alexander and all these people? Because it was preparing the way for the great story of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Amazing. Spiritually, it was a bankrupt time, there's no doubt. And morally, for all regards. I'll show you this again because this is it. This is again where they had the Christians fighting and so forth like that. Here, if you find, I'll show you what that arrow is pointing to is this, is where the cages, where they kept the wild animals to come fight against believers. They kept them in these passageways and so forth and brought them up there, the slaves and or the Christians and the animals, and they fought in this massive Colosseum. Right here, I do this because this is where the emperor's housing used to be, but here is where they feel that Paul and Peter were likely imprisoned. We went to this because it was just interesting to look at it. All it is to show us pictures of martyrs. It's the whole point of the whole thing was just again to show us this. And down here where you go down where the crypts where they had all of the places laid out where Christians were buried. A terrible time in the history of the world and the history of the empire. But I must move on. The manner is coming. Look at this. God sent out from himself a son, made of a woman, and made under the law. I come back to this. He was fully man. And not only that, he was fully righteous. See, our death for somebody else doesn't do it because we're sinners like everybody else. But he who knew no sin, right? He who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. That's how he came. Fully man, fully righteous. And only as man and only as a righteous man could Christ go to the cross and bear your sins and my sins on the cross to make us the children of God that he wished us to be. The purpose. You know, it's interesting as you look at this, the whole theme of this book from the summation of 3 and 4 is here in 5:1, and it's the beginning of all the rest of the way through. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. He came to free us. He did. Let me take you further. It's interesting because the word, let me tell you what it is. It's made from huios, which is the first three, well, I've got here. Huios in the red, and the te is to put or place. He placed us as sons. Now just wait. There are two words for child. One is teknon, which is a birth child. Huios is different. What would happen was, and I'm thinking in the context here, Ian is about that age, and Ian is the blood child of Stephen and Leslie. But at this age in his life, his parents would take him down to the local courthouse and they would state that he was now not only their birth child, but their adoptive son. He now becomes an heir, but not until that time. He's a birth child, but now he becomes a huios, an adoptive son of God, or son of this man. But here God says, we became the adoptive sons of God. We're not just those who are born. We have been born as adoptive sons and daughters of God. If you will, in the heavenly court, he's declared us to be his adoptive children. No, sister. See, this is the root of God's sovereign election. It encompasses our future resurrection. And we're heirs of God, and we're joint heirs with Jesus Christ. Listen, all that he has, we have. Not because of us, but all because of him. All because of him, he has made us his adoptive sons because we are in Christ, who is the true Son of God. And so we have become the adoptive sons of God. It's rooted in God's sovereignty. It encompasses our future resurrection. When we get to heaven, you see, we, the adoptive sons, will be there with Jesus Christ as those who are the heirs of everything. It's the present status of all believers. We're no longer slaves, we're sons. But just if you could reflect on nothing else but just that. I'm not a slave, I'm a son. Now you say, but Paul says I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. That's because he put himself in that place. But listen to me. We're no longer slaves, we're sons. We're adoptive sons of God. And that is why Jesus Christ came to this earth, not just to save us from sin, but to make us the adoptive sons of God. That's why this whole book, he says, we're no longer in bondage. We're no longer in bondage. I'm the adopted son of God. It is the most amazing truth. So the result of all of this, we're no longer slaves. We're sons and daughters. And of a son that an heir through God. We have an intimate relationship with him. And this is the great part of this. He says, he's done this so that we can cry out to God, Abba, Father. I don't know, I've been very careful. People who, when they do this, the term, they want to make this daddy. I'm not sure I'd go there, okay? But it's all right. Why the Abba? Because you see, it was the language that Jesus grew up with, not the Greek language, if you will, the Aramaic thing, and it's just that term of endearment that he had. And we come to God and we have this incredible relationship with him. The concern? This time of the year can be a time when we focus on ourselves or we focus on him. And there's no passage that stands out more in my mind than this passage here, because it tells us that in the fullness of time, God sent out from himself his son. That's the whole purpose of this celebration. It's the whole purpose. The time in the fullness of time. Fullness of time prophetically. Fullness of time politically. Fullness of time linguistically. Fullness of time in every possible way. There could not have been. And by the way, when you think about this for a bit, it was not only the Gentile world that was in a spiritual depravity, it was the Jewish world that was in a spiritual depravity. He came unto his own, and his own didn't even receive him. They're the ones who put him on the cross. Fullness of time, God sent forth his son. The manner? Made of a woman, made under the law. Fully man, fully righteous. The purpose? So that he could take us from the bondage that we had to sin and bring us into a freedom in Jesus Christ. And the result? We're no longer slaves, we're sons. And therefore we can cry out to him, Abba, Father. Somehow I just pray that God would guide us during this time of the year. It's not the date, understand this, not the date. This wasn't the date of his birth, so you understand that? It is a date that we've chosen to use to celebrate, and that's fine. But remember, the purpose of it all is not about us, it's all about him. Let's pray.